In late 1944, the United States Army learned something chilling. At the time, the Americans were fighting the Germans in the Ardennes, a forested region located between Luxembourg and Belgium. The cold and snow were devastating, making the battle experience even more savage. The misery on the scene was made worse by the news that on December 17, 1945, Waffen SS troops had committed carnage. Near the town of Malmedy, there had been a brief battle between the Americans and the Germans, which had resulted in a victory for the latter. In total, the Germans captured 84 enemies, whom they made prisoners of war. However, what happened next was an offense against the rules of all warfare, which stipulate that those detained in combat must receive dignified treatment. The Americans were forced to march to an abandoned farmhouse and line up. In front of them, 120 Germans armed with machine guns positioned themselves, who opened fire without any kind of mercy. Bursts of bullets tore apart the prisoners and left them dying on the ground, covered in lead and their clothing torn, bleeding from dozens of wounds. The few who tried to flee were shot in the back. Some took refuge in a nearby building, but the Germans caught up with them moments later and set it on fire. Meanwhile, at the same time that people were dying from the fire, some SS men walked among the still living machine gunners and finished them off with shots to the head. Hours later, the news reached the ears of the U.S. Army commanders. As expected, the rumors of the massacre soon spread among the common troops, who could not believe what had happened. Indignation was mixed with rage, hatred, and a desire for revenge. Little did the Germans know that they had inaugurated a cycle of violence that would soon turn against them. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the Chenogne massacre. To understand this story, we must first understand the plans of Nazi Germany. Towards the end of 1944, the Third Reich was hemmed in by its enemies and defeat was predicted to be near. Adolf Hitler was willing to fight until all his resources were exhausted, so on December 16 of that year, he launched the Ardennes offensive. It was a massive attack by the Wehrmacht, whose army consisted of 400,000 soldiers, 500 tanks, and 4,000 artillery pieces. If things went according to plan, the aggressor force would tear the Allies apart and force them to sign a peace treaty, ending World War II and giving Hitler a graceful exit from the conflict. One day after the Ardennes campaign began, the brutal massacre at Malmedy took place. 84 American soldiers were executed in cold blood by the Waffen SS, their bodies left out in the open. When they found them, the snow had covered them and dried the blood they had spilled, but the suffering was etched on their faces. They had been riddled with machine gun fire, although the most unfortunate had been burned alive. The news of the massacre was a scandal among the United States Army, and the commanders themselves used it as propaganda. By telling their troops what had happened, they took the opportunity to spread the idea that the Germans had no humanity and were little more than wild beasts. On the other hand, it served to remind the soldiers of the reason for their fight, which was to avenge the victims of massacres like the one in Malmedy. Little by little, the desire to avenge the fallen and execute the Nazis responsible took shape among the troops. This was helped by the fact that the American generals gave the order not to take any SS prisoners. Although this directive did not include the duty to execute anyone, the truth is that it was a subtle way of indicating to the soldiers that the execution of Germans would not be frowned upon, and that it would not even be judged by a military court. After all, if an enemy was captured and the rules stated that he could not be a prisoner, the only options available were to let him go or kill him, and allowing him to leave was a danger, since he could tip off his enemies' companions or look for reinforcement troops. On January 1, 1945, there was little to celebrate, as the Ardennes campaign continued to command American attention. They had been confident that they could thwart Hitler's offensive with relative ease, but 2 weeks had passed since the launch of the operation and they had still not driven the Germans back. The situation had now been reduced to a series of brief but intense combats fought on frozen farms or in small towns of just a few hundred inhabitants. In this context, one of the U.S. Army units, the 11th Armored Infantry Division received the order to capture the village of Chenogne. From the start, the plan was fraught with drawbacks. The first and foremost was that the division had no battle experience. On the other hand, they were sure that they would have air support, but this was not possible since a thick fog took over the field and prevented the planes from flying over the area. The Americans of the 11th advanced almost blindly, through wisps of mist and bitter cold, until they sighted their objective. It was a humble town of just 30 houses, a church, a school, and a market. They did not realize that the Germans were waiting for them armed with anti-tank and anti-aircraft artillery. When they least expected it, the ambush began, and bloody combat broke out, turning Chenogne into a smoking heap of ruins. The fight ended when the Americans outflanked the Germans and forced them to lay down their weapons, making them prisoners of war. It was a bitter victory, as dozens of Americans died in the process, and those who survived were in shock, having never fought before. They were enraged by the ambush, and the memory of the Malmedy massacre burned within them, too. However, none of this justifies what happened next. Sergeant John Fagg was a soldier in the division who remembers it as follows. Some of ours forced the Germans into line. I knew what was about to happen, and I didn't like it at all. They led a group of 30 prisoners up a hill outside the town, so that what was done to them could not be seen. The remaining 25 Germans were taken to the field and forced to stand along a path. These boys were about to be shot with machine guns. We Americans were repeating the crimes of the Germans and the Japanese. Sergeant Fagg does not describe in detail what happened next, but it is known that the Americans took aim at the Burmac soldiers and pulled the trigger. As at Malmedy, a shower of lead rained down on the prisoners, killing them instantly. It is estimated that, in total, between 50 and 60 Germans died, and that their bodies were left in the snow. It was one of the largest war crimes committed by the United States Army. In fact, General George S. Patton was informed of the facts, and noted the following in his personal diary: "The 11th Armored Division is still too green. The last time they fought they suffered numerous unnecessary casualties. They also murdered about 50 Germans. I hope we can hide it." The U.S. High Command covered up the massacre and hampered any kind of official investigation. In this way, what happened in Chenogne remained silent for decades. The corpses of the shot Germans were found days later by the inhabitants of the village, who, seeing that there was no more fighting, returned to their homes. Believing that the bodies belonged to soldiers fallen in battle, they buried them without knowing that they had actually been victims of a massacre. Only decades later, in 2018, a group of American journalists presented their investigation and the truth came out. Today, the events of Chenogne are remembered as one of the many horrors typical of all wars. We have reached the end of the video. Leave us your answer in the comment box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.